Hello and welcome everyone. We're stoked to have you all. I'm going to give you a minute while we wait for everyone to get situated and dialed in. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll because we're just curious to see what brings you to today's webinar. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your third-party risk management program? Are you a current prevalent customer? Are you just bored and you want to hear the sound of Andrew and Samira's voices? If so, I can't blame you, but either way, let me know. And I can't forget about some introductions. My name is Ashley, and I work in business development here at Prevalent. And we are joined with a very special guest, Samira Duijnmayer, the compliance manager at Booking.com. Hey, Samira.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Ashley.
And I can't forget about Andrew Snell, our very own director of solutions engineering. Hey, Andrew.
Hello, hello.
All right, and just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording along with the presentation slides shortly after the webinar. You're all currently muted, but we do encourage participation. So please put any questions in our Q&A box so we can go over them at the end of the webinar. Today, Samira will be sharing her experience in designing and implementing a third-party governance program. So Samira, I'll go ahead and pitch things over to you.
Great, thank you, Ashley. Just a quick check. Everyone can see my screen at this point. All good? All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Samira Duijnmayer, and it's great being here to talk about TPRM and my experiences. A little bit about me, who I am and how I ended up working in risk management. I work for an online travel agency, Booking.com, for almost 5 years now, based in the Netherlands, Amsterdam. I'm heading the program for third-party risk management, financial crime and financial crime compliance. I've built the programs from the ground up, which is absolutely amazing because that gives a lot of flexibility in the design of the program, currently leading a growing team responsible for designing and implementing a third-party risk management program and financial crime risk management program, policies, counterparty screening and due diligence, and key controls relevant to the programs. Prior to working for Booking.com, I used to work at several law firms, starting from doing a little bit of everything, really, finding my way to compliance and risk management, where I started advising big corporates on compliance policies and best practices on how to best manage third-party and financial crime-related risks. This work also included big investigations on money laundering, fraud, corruption scandals. I remember one of the first cases many years ago, where basically a big corporate client sought advice regarding one of its subsidiaries because there were allegations around tax evasions, money laundering, and the parent company at the time didn't know anything, but the public prosecution office basically said, oh, you're being involved in those activities as well because of not having sufficient governance and oversight. And during that investigation, we did a lot of things around data and extensive due diligence. And in this way, we were actually able to identify misconduct. I found that compliance is an area that touches upon many different fields, including regulatory, finance, technology, ethics. This multidisciplinary function is very fascinating, very complex, and you can see things from different angles. It was basically clear that data and technology was at the heart of preventing financial crime and third-party risk, and that allowed us to, help companies build a remediation of its compliance programs and protect its assets and reputation. Basically, having these far-reaching consequences in terms of potential harm to a company and working towards preventing it, it has a big impact. And personally, I believe in the butterfly effect, bringing, small steps brings larger impact that goes far beyond your company's integrity. So what I want to do today is bring you on that journey, which could help you in doing that too. So today I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the key risk and compliance trends we have seen in 2022 and going into 2023. Some common challenges companies face that I've seen over my career, I will give you some guiding principles that you can take away to build an effective TPRM program. And then we will go into key components of a TPRM framework, such as an effective governance model. So to protect the reputation of organizations, compliance programs must be dynamic and robust to adapt to new regulations, trends, and expectations. So, for instance, your program needs to be built in a way that could easily be adjusted in case new changes need to be made due to new guidances, regulations, or even results driven from company internal and external audits. So think about evolving regulations. Russian war is a good example. Many companies basically has prompted many companies to cease operations in Russia. For many organizations, the war-related sanctions create additional challenges, including ensuring that their supply chains or their supply chains, third-party suppliers are not subject to the growing list of sanctions being applied by the US, the EU, UK, or any other government. So failing to adhere to those complex sanctions rules would prove very costly, both financially and in potential damage to your reputation of the company. Or take, for instance, other increased regulations around the Slave-Free Business Certification Acts, which basically requires businesses with, I believe, an annual revenue greater than 400 or 500 million to audit their supply chains for labor practices or human trafficking activities. And then you have all the conversations at the moment around ESG expectations. Topics that are used to measure sustainability and ethical impact of an investment of an organization. This is top of mind for many organizations, but it has limited attention in relation to TPRM. So we're seeing more and more regulations around the expectations for companies to take account sustainability, human rights related regulations, sanctions, and I'm seeing more and more coming in the near future and long term. Also think about increased government enforcement actions. I'm not going to go through each of those individually, but government enforcement actions are a clear example of the increased regulatory scrutiny these days. Working with the wrong supplier or business partner could result in legal action, regulatory sanctions, financial losses, and serious damage to your company's reputation. So now I want to walk you a little bit through the key challenges that many companies face in the third-party risk management landscape. So compliance might not be integral to company culture. For many organizations, compliance is seen as, I'd say, a necessary evil with no intrinsic value. This usually comes from a lack of tone from the top culture. Not having compliance as part of your corporate culture leads to lack of executive support, no key stakeholder buy-in, lack of program ownership, lack of understanding of how the individual roles contribute to the overall compliance success. And what I'm seeing a lot is also that risk review in your third-party risk management program and legal assessments really slow down processes. For instance, privacy, asking a bunch of questions which could block or slow down the negotiation process with suppliers. And senior management may also not always prioritize the third-party risk management for a variety of reasons, right? If you think about it, they might not fully understand the impact that a third-party risk can have on their organization. They may be more focused on day-to-day operations and meeting short-term goals rather than long-term goals, and then they overlook the potential risk posed by your third-party relationships. Another reason could be that they may not have necessary resources or expertise to effectively manage third-party risks. Implementing a comprehensive third-party risk management program can be complex and time-consuming, and it may require additional staff or outside expertise to execute effectively. If senior management is not willing to invest in these resources, third-party risk management fails before it actually starts. But it could also be that they're simply unaware of the extent of the third-party relationship within your organization. So if senior management is not aware of these relationships, they may not understand associated risk and may not prioritize the third-party risk management program. So, effective controls must be underpinned by strong reporting lines, good management information, activities, that give the board assurance that the risks are appropriately managed to help them make informed decisions. On the screen, you see a couple of guiding principles. I'm not going through each one by one, but what I really want to point out is, your program needs to be ready to adopt new regulations. And I'm expecting a lot more in the near future. One size fits all program never works. Each organization has a different inherent risk profile, but there are certain guiding principles that organizations always can take into account. One of the most guiding principles I would argue to use is to embed a proactive risk management culture. So when senior management communicates that it will prioritize risk management in decision-making, it sends a message throughout the organization that risk management is a top priority. A proactive risk management culture involves creating an environment where identifying and mitigating risks is seen as a shared responsibility throughout the organization. This can then be achieved by encouraging employees to speak up about potential risks, providing training and resources to help employees identify and manage risk. Having a tone at the top actually emphasizes the importance of the risk management, and then it's taken seriously, especially with third-party risks. It's good if you think about setting up a training program and understand and make your employees understand what third-party risk management is. Employees may not always be aware of any of those requirements, whether you have a policy or not. And then employees may inadvertently violate them, putting the organization at risk of penalties and other consequences. To address those risks, organizations should prioritize training and awareness programs related to those third-party risk management. So it's actually very simple. To effectively manage third-party risk, you can establish a risk management framework. And I really want to focus on these three areas today. Your framework could include policies and procedures, but then you really need to think about, okay, how are you going to build a strong governance model that actually works? Lots of people, receive a policy or look at the policy, but they don't really do anything with it. How can you make sure to build a program that would support you in navigating a potential storm if one of the scenarios that we have spoken about would actually take place? So let us focus on this a little bit more. Governance and oversight. Without governance and oversight, organization will not have an effective program. Again, tone from the top is important, including their buy-in, have a clear value proposition. A governance model helps to improve transparency, accountability for TPRM, and helps make certain that your program operates as designed. So the governance defines actually the vision of your organization's TPRM capability and provides direction for the execution. The operating model for day-to-day functioning should include organizational structure, committees, roles, responsibilities for managing third-party risk. And the governance approach should also consider how TPRM activities integrate with other risk management functions. So you have many stakeholders that you need to engage with, but you all have the same goal, right? And it's to prevent any violations and breach to protect your company's reputation. Though the way you get there might differ from team to team or department to department. To establish an effective oversight and governance structure, you can decide to look at the TPRM framework in the context of a 3 lines of defense model, if your company has one. But we all know in practice that this doesn't always work, especially with the smaller companies. You'll have people being responsible for activities that are both first line or second line. The point is that you make clear who is responsible for what, and whether this is through a policy, a RACI, it doesn't matter as long as it's documented and effectively monitored. It is important who your third parties are, what your scope is, and what type of business you are, and where you are in your program. Taking an organization's risk appetite at the center of this is key to define the level of TPRM in the organization. So take your risk appetite. What is the level of risk that you're willing to accept in order to meet your company's strategic objectives? Depending on the size of your organization, the current state of the program, you can decide that you're willing to accept some risk, if limited, which could then be heavily outweighed by benefits for third-party risk. So why is that important? The risk appetite statement should serve as a guideline that is periodically examined and modified as it's the risk threshold your organization is unwilling to cross. Many groups are involved in development of your organization's risk appetite statement. Seek the input from your board, your senior management, key representatives, business unit leaders, even the finance department, and anyone involved in strategic planning. For instance, you can think about, as a best practice, begin defining your risk appetite statement by asking each of these groups, okay, what is the monetary amount you believe is a material loss for the organization? And every organization's size processes are unique. So there's no one size fits all approach to the risk appetite. The more mature organizations will always have different viewpoint on the risk tolerance versus smaller organizations. Then define the scope. I think this is where most of the companies struggle. Defining the scope is one of the most fundamental and also one of the most important activities in your entire third-party risk management program. Whether your organization works with 10,000 or 10,000 third parties, the problem is the same. You have limited resources. So how can you deploy them most effectively? Remember, TPRM is primarily about making the smartest use of your company's limited resources. Are your different risk teams focused on third parties and risks that have the most potential impact? Which tactics will help your company to be more proactive in managing third-party risk? Are there opportunities to be more effectively use existing or new technologies for third-party discovery, monitoring, or reporting activities? How can you optimize your company's TPRM program to make better decisions for your business? But also think about what type of third parties will you include in your third-party universe scope? Are you only going for third-party vendors who provide services to you or more? Other types of customers, some organizations include the full universe of business relationships into the scope. So my recommendation would be to deep dive into your organization's products and services that you offer, look at your third-party landscape, which would then give a good understanding of the different types of risks that you should consider. You need to determine your third-party landscape in terms of, okay, in which jurisdictions are they based? What is the type of vendor you have? Are these critical vendors? You need to determine who's in and who's out. And in order to get there, you will need to think about inherent risk. And I will get to this later, but inherent risk is what should help you create the scope of your TPRM program. Also think about the risk areas that you'd like to include. Think about compliance, security, privacy, credit, geographic, operational, strategic. How far will you go? And when will this need to be extensive? As a compliance professional, I would always argue that you need to embed compliance as a risk area to consider, but perhaps there are other areas that are less relevant to your organization. But generally, you ensure to manage risk around security and privacy and compliance. But then it's for you to decide, okay, what tools do you have available to embed more risk areas into your scope of your assessments? Or you can decide as a company, I'm going to do it in a phased approach. Take a look at security and privacy and compliance first. But once I'm mature, I will look at credit risk and reputational risk. Maybe you decide as a company that you're simply not ready to incorporate risk from the very first start. Then you need to think about centralized versus decentralized. Where will TPRM sit in the organization? Leading practices, for instance, shows that TPRM usually sits under the procurement department or certain risk domains, but a decision is important to ensure long-term program success. So define and agree on clear roles and responsibilities. Who is doing what? What is the role of procurement? Are they only responsible for maintaining vendor relationships or more? When looking at risk management and performing assessments on your vendors, do you have the right type of resources in place to manage those risks? Is this done by SMEs? All things that companies should consider when defining clear roles and responsibilities. So, look, credibility requires, both governance and metrics. Involvement of stakeholders and risk subject matter expert groups is critical to ensure credibility of the process and the results. I'm not only talking about board level commitment, but any commitment from key stakeholders and SME groups across the organizations. So how can organizations do that? You see a lot of things on the screen. Generally, organizations struggle to establish the ownership of TPRM. Ownership depends on organizational culture, risk areas assessed, and the operating model of your TPRM capability. Ownership can either lie within compliance or risk functions, or can be established by a dedicated TPRM function, sitting in procurement or outside. Organizations with mature TPRM organizations or TPRM capabilities often establish a third-party risk management office responsible for managing third parties and their associated risk. But wherever they sit, effective third-party risk management requires active integration across different functions, such as procurement, security, legal, and compliance. The operating model should then define how the TPRM capability will function and interact with its stakeholders. And when determining what kind of operating model to put in place, organizations can choose to have a centralized, hybrid, or decentralized model. The model you choose often depends on the number of different factors, such as the organization's culture, size, maturity, company strategy, and how decisions are made in the organization. Each model has pros and cons that should be considered. You can decide to have a centralized structure where the authority is maintained by the TPRM capability and using streamlined methodologies, processes, tools. I think organizations with a strong top-down culture may benefit from a centralized approach, as it's easier to trickle this down to the teams and get things done. You can also have a hybrid model whereby the TPRM capability is the central point of decision-making, but business units own certain decisions and activities. And then you have the TPRM capability identifying and collaborating with stakeholders across business units and define clear roles and responsibilities, as well as aligning on methodologies, processes, and tools. But then you can also have a decentralized structure. Managing the third-party risk falls to each individual business unit with some communication and coordination. However, each business unit may use its own methodologies, processes, templates, and tools. And what we see a lot is, a decentralized structure, which results in inconsistency of standards and duplication of resources and work. And some organizations start with a decentralized model, and then they realize that the costs associated and inconsistencies across different business units and then they change. Initially you see the change to a centralized or a hybrid structure. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer here, but consider a centralized or hybrid model which facilitates more effective and structured governance. So when you look at the slides, you can see many different governance committees. This is a proposed structure and can vary depending on the size of the organization. Governance committees are, groups or individuals within your organization that are responsible for overseeing and ensuring that the organization is following its policies, procedures, and regulations. These committees play a critical role in ensuring that the organization operates in an ethical and transparent and compliant manner. One of the most important duties of a governance committee is to provide oversight and guidance on matters related to the third-party risk management. This includes identifying potential risks, assessing their likelihood and impact, and developing strategies to mitigate them. And by doing so, those committees will also help to kind of minimize the likelihood of legal or financial repercussions that could negatively impact the organization. So when you look at the screen, you can have your program management team. Ensuring a program management team could help track against the progress of the program, someone who's responsible for clear project planning, tracking remediation, if applicable. This could sit either in the procurement department or in the risk domains, often legal and compliance due to governance ownership, but not necessarily preferred. Also, it's good to track with getting deadlines in the calendar through the build out of the program, so everyone has a clear vision on what needs to be done. And then you have your TPRM working group program that is basically a set of different people. So this group basically provides the policy setting and oversight of an end-to-end vendor life cycle process for managing risk. They can establish assessments, approach, guardrails, tools used by the risk SME groups. They can establish common standards for policy adherence. They can also be responsible for operational reporting on the risks and the program. This doesn't mean that you need someone working on TPRM 100% of the time, but you can have someone, with 50% dedication and commitment, and ensuring that you all work towards the same vision and strategy. And then you have your technical architecture group. So you can have all the different, programs and different groups looking into different areas of the program, but you need to have a team who is actually responsible for, building the tools or enhancing the tools that you currently have, or leveraging the tools that you currently have in your organization, or data analysis to report on TPRM related risks. So this is important to embed that into your program. And then you can have your oversight steering committees. And with the oversight and steering committees, see it as a group of senior management people who basically provide guidance and oversight of third-party risk management, escalations, and portfolio of your risk tolerances. So it's basically a central escalation point to your risk committee, where the OC basically advises on the recommended decisions from the TPRM working group or any other TPRM capability on high risks defined to be dealings that you currently have, or that can potentially be a violation of certain regulations. The OC can also review and advise on the design and effectiveness of the TPRM function, provide comments to a TPRM related policy, procedure, documentation. See it as a step before your risk committees. And also be mindful that not every matter or high risk matter needs to go to the oversight committee. Basically, the TPRM working group can then kind of act as a gatekeeper and kind of risk rate matters against, financial, operational, reputational, regulatory parameters defined by your organization. And once, it's deemed to be a high risk issue, then that requires senior management involvement. And you will then escalate to the oversight steering committee. And then the risk committee in turn provides direction on the rejection or acceptance of risk when such risks are determined to be outside the scope of your company's risk appetite. I think we all know, the general counter or TPRM lifecycle process end to end. When you have your governance and oversight established, you can then put this into your third-party risk management processes. What you see on the screen, it's not a one-size-fits-it-all process. Many organizations, maybe when you look at the slide, you think, I'm actually doing it differently, or our roles and responsibilities across the TPRM program are actually very different. Well, you're right. It is not a one-size-fits-it-all process. I think the wide variety of risk associated with vendors and type of vendors, is important to determine which strategy your company wants to take in order to manage the risk effectively. So your organization can determine which process to follow as long as key elements are taken into account. And as an organization, you can then decide to set minimal requirements that can then be measured against your risk appetite. As you have determined strong and effective governance, you will then be able to assign the different roles and responsibilities to your processes. Will it be the TPRM capabilities group who will review and validate the inherent risk questionnaire? Or will this be your risk pillars? Who accepts the risks? Generally, the business owner accepts the risk. Let's say there are concerning issues with a vendor security system, but the business owner still wants to work with this vendor, or there are compliance issues found in the screening processes and the compliance department advises against it. This will then again trickle down to the accountability of senior management. You're going to be putting through all these processes through the program, including the appropriate selection criteria of your vendor suppliers, doing a risk assessment, doing due diligence, ongoing monitoring, effective reporting to your board and senior management, and so on. Since all third parties do not present equal risk, they should not consume equal risk assessment capacity. So you should develop criteria to help you categorize third parties into high, medium, and low risk buckets that will help you better allocate your limited resources where they will have the most impact. If you understand the universe of your third-party relationships, then you can better determine which third party should be considered in scope and therefore subject to a risk-based due diligence exercise. Not all vendors are subject to the same level of scrutiny and are subject to a due diligence exercise. You might care less about let's say a catering company or a vendor that provides office supplies. The key to effective vendor risk management is knowing, which vendors pose the most compliance, regulatory, and reputational risk to your organization. Creating a third-party risk categorization is a key success factor for any TPRM program. Also take into account that you would include all vendors to a due diligence exercise that would be very costly in time and resources and possibly add little value to your risk efforts. Think about incorporating compliance and reputational risk questions into your inherent risk assessment or questionnaire. Is the third party a critical dependency to meet organizational objectives? Will the third party have access to confidential or customer data? Will the third party have direct access to your infrastructure? Or will your vendors work with government officials on behalf of your company? In this way, you make sure to tick off, potential bribery or corruption risk, or think about embedding questions around the jurisdictions in which your third-party operations, which could give you a good understanding of geographic risk, whether this is from a sanctions perspective or a high risk from a corruption point of view. It doesn't really matter. You need to understand your vendor risk landscape. Depending on what comes out of your inherent risk score, it will determine the level of due diligence required, which could then also reduce the risk that you identify inherently. And with that, you can think of tooling that would support getting your inherent risk score to reduce overall rating. It could also mean that there's no additional due diligence needed at all. So I really want to focus on the third and the fourth process on the screen now. Risk identification doesn't stop at onboarding. So you can decide to do your due diligence partially before contract negotiations and some pending items during onboarding. This could be a risk-based decision that you can make. Though there are some minimum requirements that you want to embed before a contractual relationship, which is, for instance, doing your sanction screening of a third party. Signing a contract with a sanctioned party could potentially violate applicable sanctions laws. But you can decide to do more due diligence or send out an enhanced due diligence questionnaire during negotiations. That's okay. You could even adjust contractual language based on potential due diligence findings. The contracting phase can help you limit the liability for your organization, set expectations, pave the groundwork for the right to audit and service level agreements. There's a lot of things you can do in the contractual agreement space. And it's key to stay transparent. Let your third parties know what your company's values are. So during the due diligence, the refresh or the periodic review, you need to make sure that your third party stays aware. You can set the tone that happens at the beginning of the contractual relationship. So in that case, you look a little bit beyond the monetary relationship here, but also approach it from the values, service delivery, ongoing effectiveness of a relationship. So how do you set that tone at the beginning? How transparent should you be in the beginning of those discussions? Your company, should clearly identify and communicate your needs. If you're not transparent, your third parties won't be transparent either. Contract reviews are really an effective way to invest resources in evaluating third-party risk and controls. So while contract reviews are, generally performed by your legal team, it's ideal to embed a legal team into the process with close collaboration with your risk-related teams. You can then embed language that helps you gain higher level of assurance that your third parties can be held accountable for meeting control obligations. And when these are all finished, we'll then move to the onboarding phase. This includes setting up the third-party service provider in a system with, master data records and contact information, payment information, insurance, licensing documentation if applicable, but also communicating your supplier code of conduct and successfully completing an associated training requirement. Ensure that all third parties comply with legal compliance laws and regulations and ethical standards, and to facilitate understanding of the supplier code of conduct and expectations. The supplier code of conduct is not a legal binding document, but a contract is. So what you can do is refer to your supplier code of conduct in the terms and conditions. So the supplier code of conduct really sets the tone. It is your responsibility to ensure that your suppliers understand what is expected of them. If you look at, for instance, all the benefits of supplier code of conduct, by doing that, you set really clear expectations in a way that they can kind of consult and engage with. It helps to protect your company's reputation in the event of breaches or violations, and making sure that your supplier code of conduct ensures to include language around, labor laws, financial crime compliance, environmental importance. Your code of conduct is really the opportunity to embed all those risk areas that you'd like your supplier to adhere to. And then there are specific items that you can take into account. So for instance, managing risk around bribery and corruption. You can decide to issue, for instance, a third-party acknowledgement and certification form, whereby the third party represents and warrants and agrees that the third party will not take any action that would kind of constitute a violation of the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act, or your company's anti-corruption policy or any other anti-corruption laws. You can even use that certification form to kind of warrant that they will not violate and agree with complying all applicable laws around, new ESG regulations, human rights, modern slavery, financial crime. It's a nice way to kind of embed that into your program as well. And lastly, I would say around the onboarding phase is that you can think about a way to issue a short training module for your suppliers. A training course could basically outline the supplier code of conduct principles, and in this way your company sets clear expectations for suppliers. And then focusing a little bit on the monitoring piece. I think third-party risk management and due diligence and monitoring usually takes a backseat after the third party has been brought on board. This makes organizations unaware of likely third-party risk, and which if left unmitigated can lead to critical issues that could significantly affect the reputation of your organization. It doesn't really matter if the liability is on the third party side. Ultimately, the company that engages the third party is held responsible by regulators and customers for not identifying and addressing the issue. Risk is not static. It fluctuates from time to time. Performing ongoing monitoring of the third party relationship once the contract is in place is essential to our ability to manage risk of your third party relationship. It should ensure standards that are set by the program and being implemented and then also followed through the relationship cycle to capture any material changes after the third party has been onboarded, but also limit the implications of potential failures in the due diligence process, for instance. So in this phase, it's important to periodically request and collect and reassess. You might be working with a vendor for many, many years. And you have come to a point where you need to be reviewing the contracts or language in the contracts, or look at the policies and get a view on how the vendor would actually notify you in case there's a breach of your data and system, or the vendor might decide to move his data center to a different country. That already leads to a whole different set of issues, cross-border laws. Or think about the ongoing sanction screening of your third parties. And if your third parties are deemed high risk, do an ongoing enhanced screening that captures more than just sanctions. Regulators all expect us to capture all of those elements while taking a risk-based approach. So not all organizations have the budget or flexibility to utilize technology or automation, but there are some key elements that organizations can take into consideration. And with the move, towards digitalization and our automated third-party risk management, streamlining processes, can provide a framework to simplify TPRM with fact-based decision-making. Think about ensuring that you have correct data on your third-party vendors, whether this is, via an Excel spreadsheet or vendor management system. Without this data and understanding who your vendors are and what type of vendors, it will be difficult to do a risk classification in the first place. Think about leveraging external sources, while internal screening, assessments, onboarding, risk assessment, continuous monitoring are very critical to the third-party due diligence. It is also important to take information from outside of the organization if you have the resources to do so. Your company could validate your third parties via, external sources like credit ratings, sanctions lists, adverse media. This could provide a complete assessment of third-party risk that would account for politically exposed exposure, ABC, AML, maybe now even ESG risk, which since the S areas is largely increasing. And while this can be done manually, it sometimes becomes burdensome, even if conducted for a small set of critical third parties. So also technology can be used to automate this activity and provide relevant intelligence quickly. For compliance risk, for instance, this could potentially be picked up by negative news rather than you going into Google and search about what you can find about your third-party vendors. But also think about your supplier code of conduct. Manual outreach can become burdensome. Chasing your vendors to acknowledge and certify often leads to a low response rate. There are quicker ways to embed this into your program. So if you have a procurement management system or any other system that you can onboard your suppliers in, have them sign and certify before they're able to onboard in the system. Without acknowledging and signing, they're not able to onboard and create invoices. So in this way, you can enforce this. You can even do this within your terms and conditions. And then, I always say you are what you measure. Measuring both operational metrics and risk portfolio statistics enables TPRM to elevate to a strategic business partner. Measure against your organization's risk appetite, which is very important. Have systems that accurately capture and report TPRM program data that is critical to define those baselines, establish targets, and measure results. Have an incident log to ensure all incidents are stored and automatically assigned for investigations. Have weekly, monthly, or quarterly KPIs and KRIs that would actually report on potential vendors onboarding from higher risk jurisdictions or vendors that are flagged for an enhanced due diligence in the ongoing monitoring process of your program. In this way, your senior management can get a good grasp of the risk and type of third parties your organization has, and then he or she knows where to put its resources to. So don't rush the build out of a program. I would say Rome wasn't also built in one day. Your company should take the time to build a program. Most companies take years to get them to a mature level. Also, the regulatory landscape changes over time, rapidly respond and have baseline compliance program, in order to kind of respond to changing regulations and political issues, whether this is around sanctions, human rights, or cybersecurity. I would say crawl first, set the responsibility for TPRM program, including the budget, headcount, funding, mobilize your project teams and project governance, validate vision and gain alignment across risk pillars and technology initiatives. Start with risk assessments and your existing vendor population, so you're able to better understand, okay, where are the risks and what are the resources you need to use. Then after that, design and an operating model that works for you. launch risk pillar initiatives to standardized practices and standards, launch new processes, technology, and policies for TPRM. Also think about, establishing and launching a change management strategy and approach to start behavioral changes. So you see a natural progression on your proactive TPRM culture across the organizations. And then automate the program to manage end-to-end process. Use the technology for an IRQ, due diligence, screening, reporting, dashboards, and so on. Have a central repository of your third-party risk data and performance metrics. And then you also see naturally that the governance is enforced and working. Have a centralized management of your TPRM program. So a couple of key takeaways. Define your vision and strategy from the very beginning when building your TPRM program. What is your North Star? And work towards that. If your goal is to build an integrated and coordinated framework to manage risk effectively and prevent or mitigate negative outcomes such as financial loss, reputational damage, or legal action, make sure you embed and check those points. Are we actually doing that? And is what I'm doing actually needed? I would say even the best program fails without adoption. So organizational adoption must be strictly tied to a compelling value proposition, avoiding negative perception that can impact success. Senior leadership drives change. High-level sponsorship is needed to communicate business cases and make business decisions. Involve them early in the process to sustain effective adoption of the program. Get buy-in from your senior leaders in the company, train them on the risks so they know why they need to put their money and resources into it. Also, I would say, engage all the stakeholders early in the process. So the moment that you think, any risk domain needs to be included in a process or procurement, wherever you sit, it's easier to start to engage people in the beginning of the process, but then also build that relationship also past kind of go live from the build out of your TPRM program. You can also think about embedding clear policies and standards. For regulated institutions, obviously this is mandatory, but basically a policy kind of gives you a roadmap to the success of your third-party risk management program. And lastly, I would say make your program audit-proof. It's always useful to think from the lens of an auditor. What do they audit against, whether it's internal or external, and make sure you check that off. So speak to your internal audit function and have an open discussion about what they usually audit against, and this gives you a framework to work with. I know I'm speaking a lot, so I'm also cautious of time. So I also welcome the audience to ask questions or, of course, have an open discussion. Let me look at the questions. I'm looking at Ashley here because I'm not able to.
Yeah, we're actually going to pitch things over to Andrew and let him kind of go over things, and we're going to go over questions at the end.
All right, perfect. Well, I hope it was helpful, and we'll leave the questions to the end. I'm handing over to Andrew now, who will speak a little bit about Prevalent and how Prevalent can support with building an effective TPRM program. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Samira. Perfect. All right, just a couple quick slides just to go through, kind of map a little bit around what Samira talked about with kind of program development and then the execution of that, right? So once programs are established, processes are established, there's a need to then operationalize those, right? So Prevalent, as a SaaS-based solution, which includes the technology and also services that wrap around to that, provides organizations a path to achieve these goals that we're sharing on the screen here. really helping from a program perspective, get the data that you need. And Samira talked about this as part of the process is kind of accessing meaningful intelligence to support risk-based views of vendors that support your business, right? With this, Samira talked a lot about different stakeholders that get involved across the life cycle. So increasing team efficiencies, breaking down silos, a key piece to that, right? Defining the process and then executing on that. And then with that, being able to evolve and scale the program over time, right? Another thing that Samira talked about is that organizations are challenged with resourcing, right? So how does Prevalent help support that, right? And we do that in a couple different ways, and we'll touch on that very quickly. Now, when we look at kind of the third-party life cycle, a lot of what Samira talked about from the start to the finish of engaging with a vendor, sourcing and selection, intake, onboard, scoring inherent risks, assessing, remediating, monitor, validate, measuring performance, all the way through offboarding and termination. Prevalent has been developed to be able to support that entire life cycle, right? There's some common challenges that exist throughout that. I think we're probably all very aware of those challenges that exist, and that includes process, that includes program, that includes silos, that includes data, that includes the lack of automation to be able to, make those processes more efficient, right? So you'll see the different stakeholders listed on the bottom here. Prevalent has been developed to be able to support these groups working together more efficiently to take that program that's been established and again, operationalize it, right? When we look at how we do that, so there's a few different ways in which Prevalent supports and automates and accelerates third-party risk management. It's our people. So we have managed services that can layer on top of our technology to really help streamline some of the day-to-day tasks. So resourcing, bandwidth, right? We have a lot of conversations with a lot of organizations within this marketplace. And again, Samira talked about this as well. When we're looking at establishing a program, we need to understand our resourcing capabilities, right? So we work with a lot of companies that say, hey, well, we got to do this, we have to scale this, but we don't have the people, the bandwidth, the capacity to do it. So our technology helps, but our people can help also as an extension of your team to really help in that area, right? We have data, right? So cyber intelligence, business intelligence, financial insights, ESG related insights, for continuous awareness of what's happening with these vendors and suppliers through the life cycle, right? So this certainly helps onboarding, sourcing and selection, quick insights into risk information during the contract phase, post-contract, ongoing relationship, kind of the buoy system in place to ensure when things pop up across these key risk areas, the teams are made aware. And then the platform piece to kind of house all of this, kind of the glue of all of it, to provide that single source for organizations to manage the process steps throughout the life cycle, to access the intelligence, to pull meaningful reporting, to be aware at any point in time where we are from a process perspective, but further to that, where does the risk live and how have we reduced it, right, back to the organization. Just a splash screen of risk areas that are typically addressed within our solution, and these are data feeds that are fed in. It's also a combination of direct engagements and due diligence with vendors where organizations can assess across all of these different risk areas, right? So again, we talked a lot during this conversation around working more efficiently with stakeholders in the business, right? We have information security that probably cares about a certain kind of sector of risk. We have procurement teams and sourcing teams that might be focused elsewhere, business and compliance and legal teams. So the idea being that third-party risk is multifaceted, and we have different areas of risk that we support our customers with assessing, identifying, and then remediating within our platform, okay? And then lastly, kind of just to sum that up, right? Our approach to third-party risk is smart, unified, and prescriptive, right? Again, taking everything that Samira talked about as far as things you need to consider, programs that you should develop, processes that you should probably think about establishing, and then operationalizing that to be smart, right? So data-driven analytics, right? Role-based reporting to really operationalize all of that and work as efficiently as possible, making best use of data, working faster, working smarter, right? Unified, bringing teams together, breaking down silos, accessing different sets of intelligence, different views of risk, in a single place to support the entire life cycle, right? From onboarding all the way through offboarding. And then prescriptive, right? In addition to all of that process automation and efficiency, being able to set the stage for what happens next, right? With prescriptive next steps when risks are elevated, having playbooks and remediation plans and facilitating those back and forth with the third parties, automating workflow and collaboration across different stakeholders and team members, right? And with that, as I mentioned before, our team as well can provide expertise, both from an advisory perspective, but also from an execution perspective to work as an extension of your team. Okay, so again, that's it from my side. Just wanted to kind of tie that together with the technology piece, how Prevalent fits into that, right? We got the program, we got the process, establish that, and then there's the execution. And Prevalent really steps in at that point in the life cycle to really help introduce a lot of the operational efficiencies from a people, process, and a data perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's go ahead and get through some of these questions. Samira, Donald asked, do you see the effectiveness of TPRM vary based on which areas the group reports to, i.e. procurement, risk compliance?
It's a very good question. So I would say, yeah, I think it's clear that if the group, doesn't involve the different risk domains. So let's say your third-party risk management program is owned by your procurement department. They don't have the resources in place or the skill set to effectively build an end-to-end process. They're very much responsible for their vendor relationships, and they know how to embed that into kind of their procurement tooling, but they don't necessarily know how to embed those risk domains into the program. And what we're seeing a lot is that, or what I've seen a lot over the last few years in my career, is that it's very effective to have kind of a more centralized TPRM function that doesn't necessarily sit in a particular organization where you only have cybersecurity people owning that process, but you have a set of people as part of your different risk domains that will be involved in the build out of such, and that is definitely more effective. And getting the right people in the room. So that's why I think the TPRM working group can be very effective, because you get all the perspectives from different domains, I would say.
Thanks, Samira. And the next question is actually for you, Andrew, and it's, can you provide any references or use cases as to how Prevalent automates TPRM?
Yeah, we sure can. And that certainly applies to different stakeholders, right? So when we look at information security, it's, identifying control-based risk, looking at risk through the lens of regulatory compliance, NIST, ISO, and others. We have other use cases that map back to, procurement and sourcing activities when we're looking at non-infosec related risk, anti-bribery, modern slavery, ESG, right, where it's less kind of regulation based, but more, business focused risk assessment. So the bones of the Prevalent platform supports the automation of delivering risk-based due diligence, whether that's questionnaire-based assessments, whether that's artifact gathering and associated data, and making the risk assessment process for those different stakeholders more efficient. So we also have some materials that we certainly can share as well that outline different use cases and how Prevalent has been overlaid on top of those risk assessment use cases to introduce some efficiencies.
Thanks, Andrew. And Samira, one last question for you. What challenges can you share with the audience identifying or initiating third-party profile and setup?
Many. So what I've seen a lot is that it all starts with your categorization of your vendor landscape. So if you don't know what your vendors or who your vendors are, what type of vendors you have. I mean, one organization works with 100 vendors, the other organization works with 20, 30,000 vendors. So you need to have a kind of a methodology in place where you are aware of, okay, what type of vendors do you have, and what level of risk do they present to your company? And in that way, you're able to better kind of put a risk profile together. I would definitely say that that has been a challenge over the last couple of years, because, you know, we have inaccurate data, for instance, and I've also seen, you know, lots of companies not having an automated solution where they're all working with spreadsheets and different lines in the organizations working with different types of vendors that doesn't necessarily go through a procurement system. So you'll see, you know, that you don't have a kind of a correct vendor landscape, which often leads to an incorrect kind of risk profiling of your vendors. Maybe you have vendors sitting in your landscape that are very high risk from a corruption perspective, but you don't even know that you're working with those vendors. I think that's one of the biggest challenge I have seen, and I think it's something that can be solved with, you know, doing a proper vendor classification and inherent risk assessment of your vendor landscape.
Thanks, Samira, Andrew, and everyone for all of your questions. They both gave us some really great information to take in today. So I hope to see all of you either in your inbox or at a future Prevalent webinar. Cheers, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.